All right, here is part 2 of my Passenger Stella Maris series. And so here is the edition I read of Stella Maris, the very much nicer looking version from the box set. And so yeah, just aesthetically speaking, I thought the singular hardcover printings were shockingly bad design, because you can't even tell that the really nice orange sunset is actually a nuclear bomb. So huge mistake, I think, but the box set does it justice. So I was glad I was finally able to see the true vision on the box set. So I'd recommend, if you haven't bought any of them yet, buy the box set. Although, if you know about my videos, it's almost certain that you have been anticipating this as much as I have. So anyway, all right, so Stella Maris. Yeah, I did not take the day off for Stella Maris, but I got it that day and I read about half of it that night. I think I got about halfway through, about page 90 to 100, and then pretty sure I finished it the next day when I got home again. It's December 6th. That was a work day, and then I don't remember what the 7th was, but anyway, I read it in 2 to 3 days. Of course, half the length of The Passenger, much quicker read, but definitely more dense than The Passenger. Some of the conversations in The Passenger, and I even forgot to talk about two things. Well, I'll swing back to one thing in The Passenger when I talk about something else in this video. But yeah, Stella Maris, definitely more focused and more dense than The Passenger. So when I was reading it, it almost felt, it was almost hypnotic to me. Like, even a quarter of the way in, I was starting to get like this, yeah, hypnotic feeling from the back and forth of the psychiatrist and Alicia. And I really like the voice. I really like the voice of Alicia and the created character of it. I think she's although, as someone who has watched every interview McCarthy's done and read, interviews and all this sort of thing, so I think I have a relatively good feeling for what he's like and his opinions and this sort of thing. Not interpersonally what he's like, but from reading his books, you learn who a person is through their books. I think really reading someone's books is almost more intimate than knowing them for years, because it makes me think, out of the people that know me, even people that I've been friends with or worked with or whatever, how much more could they learn about like who I am from reading things I've written, personally, things I've written and, try to done justice to. They would learn a lot. So I think you can map that onto McCarthy in the same way, and, you can know him pretty well if you read his books. That's not implying his friends don't read his books, but anyway. So with that being said, some of the things that Alicia was saying, I could recognize and think, okay, this is McCarthy right here. Like, this is almost word for word McCarthy. I will say, though, that was pretty rare. I would say the majority of what was going on was like a theoretical position that an exaggerated McCarthy would think. So like, all writers, all good writers at least, split up who they are and then exaggerate it or multiply it to create characters. Clearly Gaddis did this as well. Shakespeare, name any writer, any good writer, any great writer. So in that way, people are, I heard some people say, oh, is this just a mouthpiece for McCarthy? Clearly not. And if you need evidence of that, watch the somewhat unfortunate interview between him and Lawrence Krauss. And Lawrence Krauss at some point makes a egregious error where he says, "Oh, this is you say this," and then he quotes something of Alicia, and then McCarthy says, "Hey, listen here, that's my character speaking, not me," and he points at him and everything, and he totally livens up, this 89-year-old McCarthy, and I just loved that. Put Lawrence Krauss in his place. People need to be put in their place in that way, that they think that McCarthy is creating a 20-year-old character, very smart 20-year-old character, but nonetheless a 20-year-old character. Is an 89-year-old McCarthy going to have the same opinions as a 20-year-old character? Again, even a very bright 20-year-old character with schizophrenia and synesthesia and all this? Of course not. So there were points where the general kind of setup, it felt to me, and I might read a couple passages, but I might just go kind of more freely on this one, where I'd be reading it and I'd be like, okay, this could be like an essay from McCarthy. This could be the Kekule problem or something. And then like halfway through the paragraph, I would say, okay, well, this is no longer McCarthy. This is him trailing off on some, this is the character. And it merges together well. And I don't mean to say it's literally what McCarthy would write, maybe, but like the idea is, okay, yeah, McCarthy could believe this, or he could ask this or something. The considerations on the philosophy of mathematics, like Platonism, mathematical Platonism, and thoughts on Gödel, and different anecdotes about different mathematicians and physicists and so on. Definitely McCarthy has these considerations, and in his interviews you can tell he thought about these things, and you can tell what is stuff he believes or what he considers and what he doesn't believe. One other thing I will say that I imagine some people had problems with, but again, this would be a problem of the audience, not the writer, that if you see these names of scientists and mathematicians and these sort of things, and you just see like foreign names, I can imagine how it would be overwhelming, but in the end, that's your fault that you're ignorant. These these people who, he should have fluffed it up a little more with explanations. It's like, I feel like there is something, a tool of some sort that could be used to elucidate some of these names, but that's just me. But in a way, I feel lucky that I was curious enough to have looked up, not all, but 90% of the names he mentions before. I love physics, so I looked those people up. Mathematicians, I've found a new love for mathematics later in life, after I'm done with school. So I've, the Bourbaki group, notably Andre Weil is in there, and I'll come back to that. Andre Weil, the brother of Simone Weil. Grothendieck was in the Bourbaki group, Riemann, Gödel, Einstein, Heisenberg, Schrodinger, all these people have, lively partitions in my mind of anecdotes and stuff. I think in that way, The Passenger and Stella Maris were written for me. And I feel very grateful. I feel very grateful that some of my interests aligned with McCarthy's. I think it vindicates some of the things I've been learning. It tells me I'm on the right track. But to focus a little more on the book, so when I started reading Stella Maris, I noticed a pretty significant tone change in Alicia from the Alicia in The Passenger to Alicia in Stella Maris. Stella Maris meaning the star of the sea, which apparently is a relation or is a connection to Mary. So, Jesus connections to Christian imagery, and most notably, I think Adam and Eve imagery throughout both. And that's something I wanted to save more for when I was talking about this, because it's an objective, provable connection you can make that, Bobby's Adam and Alicia's Eve. Symbolically, of course. But Alicia in Stella Maris felt much more acerbic and sharp and almost like harshly playful, where in The Passenger that seemed to be mostly reserved to the kid. So again, the kid is the prism of Alicia was split, and then the kid is one of her parts of her personality, and then we don't see it split anymore in Stella Maris. It is just her. So that's at least the way I conceptualized it. And the way he portrays schizophrenia, I'm no verified clinical psychologist or anything, but I did quite a lot of research into it in the years where I was really studying psychology hard, and totally justifiable portrayal, very true. His portrayal of a genius, a very intelligent person, spot on. And his portrayal of synesthesia, I've heard from someone who has synesthesia, is very accurate, spot on again, which should be no surprise. McCarthy is, a very astute observer of humanity, like the great modernists, Joyce, Proust, and so on. So I found Alicia's voice to be very compelling, and as opposed to Joy Williams in her review, which I think is a very good review, but I disagree that Stella Maris is the weaker point, and I'm kind of surprised, and I almost think there's an ideological hang-up that some readers are having with it. But I loved the discussions on mathematics, and it's really made me want to get more into philosophy of mathematics. Like, the two people I'm going to go back and read more, the person I'm going to reread is Charles Sanders Peirce, and then the person I'm going to read for the first time is Hilary Putnam, who is the son of Samuel Putnam, the famous Romance language translator, who I read Don Quixote in its translation the first time, but kind of an interesting connection with, the humanities and mathematics there, father and son. Because Hilary Putnam's a guy. But yeah, so Hilary Putnam, who McCarthy actually mentions specifically in that Krakauer interview that was put out, that was recorded 5 years ago, but put out when The Passenger was published. Fascinating interview. I'll link that. If you haven't watched it, you have to watch it. And then Charles Sanders Peirce, who I don't remember if he's specifically named in either book, but, major American philosopher. So excellent to read. So let's see. A couple of things I wanted to mention as really interesting technological connections that I was honestly shocked to see McCarthy mention. So first of all, going back to The Passenger, he basically mentions Bitcoin. He does it through Klein, the private investigator who has this kind of conspiracy theory how, the government doesn't like, or they're going to control digital currencies and you won't have any freedom anymore and all this stuff. So I thought it was kind of funny that, he was mentioning Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and that's such a big thing now. And then in Stella Maris, there are multiple jokes about Eliza. And I've talked to a couple of people who weren't really familiar with that, but it has a connection to GPT-3 or Chat GPT, where It's really the first computer program that passed the Turing test. A Turing test is the test, can it trick a person to thinking it's a person, but in reality it's an algorithm or text generator or whatever. So what ELIZA was a very, very simple computer program made in, I think, the late 60s, where all it did, it was very rudimentary. It would start off with a handful of like set questions that would kind of prime the responses in a certain direction, and then it would, ask very simple follow-up questions like, as an example, how are you feeling today? I'm feeling sad. They respond. And then it would just turn that into a question. You're feeling sad? And then, boo, just drops your whole life story, a blog post or whatever. Some people were so lonely that they would talk to this thing for hours and hours, even if logically they knew that this was, a robot or a computer, as they would have seen it at the time. So the joke in the book is that, oh, you're so robotic, you're so predictable, you might as well be this, simple, cheap computer program. That's basically what Alicia's saying to the psychiatrist, and then they have like a running joke back and forth about that. But I've been showing my students GPT-3 through ChatGPT and getting them to write essays in it and stuff like that. But I also found out it can grade essays. So, I just thought that was fascinating that McCarthy's keeping up with technology to such an extent that he's able to talk about it freely, and 89 years old, shocking that he's able to keep up with that. I mean, even that he's such a brilliant guy, I was impressed that he made these connections. Of course, he's been at the Santa Fe Institute for the last 30 years at least, so talked to a lot of other really smart people, a lot of probably younger smart people too. But very impressed, McCarthy. You've managed to impress me. Let's see. Yeah, so I think I'll skip most of the mathematical philosophy stuff. I think about that a lot, but I don't have enough to say about it to any meaningful degree. What I will kind of focus more in on, because it's talked about in a different way in this book as opposed to The Passenger. The Passenger, I think, Bobby absorbs the guilt of his father, either that his father should have shown but didn't, or did have but just didn't show. And we see that in that first passage I read out, the imagery of Bobby sitting in a pew in a church and imagining the just apocalyptic destruction that his dad helped enable. In Stella Maris, we get a more detached view of it, or a more ambiguous, ambivalent kind of, could be this, could be that. The part I think about is when she's talking about her father. Oh, my father helped create the nuclear bomb. And then they start talking about how did they react when it was dropped, the Trinity test. Well, they all said, "Holy shit, really?" No, it's like this. Most of them didn't say anything. Oppenheimer supposedly quoted the Bhagavad Gita, but he mistranslated time as death. That's true. I think the more literal translation that I've seen, or the more not literal but justifiable translation, is, I am time, the destroyer of worlds, not I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. But maybe Oppenheimer was a little more correct in certain ways. So that was interesting. Also, McCarthy mixed some anecdotes of Feynman in with Alicia and Bobby's father about him not wanting to wear the government glasses. Oh, that could be a metaphor for something, because he wouldn't see it right. So he, used different goggles or whatever. The story of Feynman is that he just used his car windshield so that he could see it with his eyes, and not through these thick welder's glasses that look like the bottom of like Coke bottles or whatever. So I thought that was kind of funny that, McCarthy's mixing and matching anecdotes and coming up with fictional stories based on reality. And that's kind of a trivial version of it, but this question, was Bobby still in his coma in the whole of The Passenger? Is The Passenger a creation of Alicia, or is Stella Maris a creation of Bobby? Or in The Passenger are all the Alicia sections how Bobby sees his sister rather than how she really was. Also, we never get a definitive answer on, this incestuous love they feel for each other, which seems to be relatively equal in the sense of the love, but in the acting it out, it seems like Alicia was more determined. But we never hear a clear view on that because we only hear it really from Alicia's perspective, and she could be, being very self-destructive and overly harsh and exaggerating, apart from what really happened. But it does seem to be 100% true that they never had sex, they never had children, which I think that's a reasonable question, but I think the answer is pretty obvious as well. Also, one other thing, I feel very fortunate. I had a book club of these two books at my work. I work at a high school, and shockingly, most English teachers don't read, but 3 other male teachers at my school read, and I think I was kind of some of the impetus for it because I'm just so into McCarthy, but this is like the publishing event of the decade so far. I mean, what can you think of that was so much more impressive from 2012? In America, definitely international books are several can be named, but so anyway, we had a reading group. We met up, had some snacks, whatever, ate, talked about both books for an hour and a half, and that was awesome. I feel extremely fortunate that I was able to have that at my work because I know a lot of people who read don't know anyone in their lives who read, can't talk about it to anybody, which is why we have, YouTube channels and things like this. But so I just feel extremely fortunate, and some of my ideas that I thought about, and some of my, like when I say, some people think, some of it's coming from the book club, some of it's coming from I read a review here or there, some of it's coming from the Discord channel that I have associated with this YouTube channel where we discussed it a little bit. But yeah, I think this idea about, okay, the love between the brother and sister, this romantic love, I didn't take it literally. I took it as McCarthy is clearly drawing a connection between Adam and Eve and Bobby and Alicia. The piece of evidence you get is, the objective piece of evidence you get for that is in Stella Maris, where Alicia says, "Bone from my bone." And of course, Eve is created from Adam's rib. So clearly McCarthy's, bringing that to mind. And when I made those connections, I couldn't help but think of, it's in book 11 in Paradise Lost, where Adam is fully realizing what the expulsion from Eden means. He's all of a sudden, innocence is lost, the knowledge is gained. And, he realizes that he's going to have children, and he realizes what that will mean. And the way I kind of imagine it, and I would definitely recommend reading it if you haven't, or if it's been a while, reread book 11, where John Milton shows the scroll of history unravel in front of Adam's eyes. Cain and Abel, wars, famines, destruction, and presumably at the end of that scroll of history, you see a drop of the sun falling on, the earth, and then, the mycoidal phantom, the mushroom cloud appear. And notably, Adam decides to go along with it. But that's before anything happened. That's just, theoretically, okay, it's over there. That's the way I take it. Now we have Bobby and Alicia with the scroll of history in the past. And they decide not to go along with it. They decide not to create. Bobby stops physics, becomes kind of a ridiculous race car driver. Alicia stops mathematics and buys a $300,000 violin. And they decide not to have children. And that's the difference, where they're the not the antithesis, and not the opposite, not the mirror version, but they're the counterpoint to Adam and Eve in that way, I think. Where Adam and Eve are progress, they enable progress. Alicia and Bobby disable it in their own lives. They reject the endless seeking, the destabilizing change. I think of W.B. Yeats. After World War I, you have his Sailing to Byzantium and Second Coming, those two poems. I definitely think they were on McCarthy's mind as he wrote this book. I think of The Passenger and Stella Mars as the same book. But we haven't fixed it. We haven't solved it to this day, to 2022, nearly 2023. All these considerations that are in the book are taking place in 1972 and 1980 that stretch back to 1940s and 30s. That really, I think, were obvious by the 1600s, by the time you get to Newton and Spinoza and Leibniz, were obvious to people who cared. Most people didn't. And then to only the most brilliant and expansive thinkers leading back to the ancient times could consider these kind of things. But we have the reference to Spengler, who McCarthy says is bullshit, is full of shit or whatever, which I was glad to see that because it's so blatantly obvious that he is. He does say he has some, points to take from him, but Toynbee does a critique of Spengler, and then multiple people do critiques with Toynbee and this sort of thing, but the civilization scale analysis, I think McCarthy was really interested in. And one of my friends recently got me onto a book by Alfred Kroeber about this sort of thing. So hopefully I'll be able to talk about that sooner than later on this channel. But let me see. Is there anything else? Well, I think to go along with the very uplifting nature of these two books, I will read the last page of this one as well, which, is just so touching. All right. So she's talking about being in Romania. Crossing the ancestral lands by foot, maybe by night. There are bears and wolves up there. I looked it up. You could have a small fire at night, maybe find a cave, a mountain stream. I'd have a canteen for water, and when the time came that I was too weak to move about, after a while the water would taste extraordinary. It would taste like music. I'd wrap myself in the blanket at night against the cold and watch the bones take shape beneath my skin, and I would pray that I might see the truth of the world before I died. Sometimes at night the animals would come to the edge of the fire and move about. Their shadows would move among the trees, and I would understand that when the last fire was ashes, they would come and carry me away, and I would be their Eucharist, and that would be my life, and I would be happy. I mean, you get the cave painting imagery. You imagine these, these animals, these symbolic animals moving on the walls of caves, these wolves and bears and horses running, and you have when the last fire goes out, just this is clearly, this is what McCarthy's thinking about. He's thinking about, and this is what we should all think about. I mean, at a certain point, he's thinking about the loss he's gone through in his own life, of course. He's thinking about each individual's death, of course. And death is a gang boss. But he's also thinking about cultural, civilizational, and the final death of humanity, which is highly likely, even in a short time span is highly likely. The chance that we thread the needle, the chance that we keep threading the needle is highly, highly unlikely, Of course, if you want to lie to yourself, it's fine. We all have to live our own ways, but yeah, I think this idea that, at what point do we stop and ask, where is this progress headed? And, I recognize that sometimes when these sort of questions are asked, it's by these, these brain dead types that are okay with the progress that created guns because they love guns, but they're not okay with the progress that has made their social group less powerful. Now, clearly, McCarthy is not thinking about something so trivial as that, and I'm not either. I'm thinking about, at what point do we truly consider where our civilization is headed. Now we have a global civilization. We no longer have Western civilization and Eastern civilization or any possible split. There's no split anymore. The only civilization we have is a global civilization. If one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong. So that means that there's no, if China collapses, Europe can't take over. And if Europe collapses, the Middle East takes over for a little while, and this sort of interplay. That's no more. If the collapse happens, it's all, the London Bridge is falling down. So I think that's the final concern. Where are we headed? Where have we been? Where are we now? And where are we headed? And really the last question is extremely important for anyone who has children and who is alive right now and living their life. Where are we going to be headed? What are we doing? What is progress? Is the progress that we kind of thoughtlessly accept, is that true progress? The progress of creating more and more um, powerful artificial intelligence technologies that can control humans more and more. Is that control what we want? Maybe. Should we control with artificial intelligence or with something else, with ourselves, this sort of thing? At what point do we, it's like when you see a 12-year-old that has, a six pack. It's like, wait a minute. Something's out of balance here. Life out of balance. My favorite movie, Koyaanisqatsi, Life Out of Balance. That's what this is about. It's not all progress is a mistake. It's not something stupid like that. It's not decline of the West, brain dead stuff like this. It's life out of balance. How can we regain balance? And it's not by going to the past. It's not by staying where we're at. And certain futures, it's not going there either. No one has the answer, and if people avoid thinking about it because it's sad or it's spooky or it's hard or whatever, that just decreases the chance that we'll get there. So I think the passenger and Stella Maris are, they are pessimistic, but they are very hopeful. They're very hopeful. So anyway, all right, well, I'll end this one here. And I think I might have like 2 more videos, one where I talk about books that I thought about related to these two, and then one where I think about my like kind of future reading interests going forward. So anyway, let me know what you thought about this one. Let me know what you thought about Stella Maris, and Death is a Gang Boss.